Hello, world, and welcome to episode 8 of the Last Comic Book Standing podcast. This week, we are reviewing POWERSOFX issue number 4. Just a quick recap, since it's been a couple of weeks since the last issue came out. So, on multiple timelines, mutants face total extinction and basically annihilation at the hands of highly powerful artificial intelligence robots. There has been only one mutant that has reincarnated over and over, witnessing this complete wipeout of mutants from the planet. Her name is Moira McTaggart. Last issue of Powers of 10, we saw a team of mutants assemble to obtain very important information on how to prevent this from happening and provide that information to Moira. It just so happened in order to put it to use, she had to be killed so that she could be born again in a future timeline and finally help prevent the destruction of mutants. We left off with Wolverine killing her in the last frame. This is where we continue the story. And here we see the beautiful cover art of issue number 4, Powers of 10. We see Professor X dead center with his Cerebro helmet surrounded by various mutants in the X-Men universe. And we have a quote from the professor himself. "I fear our needs will far outlast our desires. We have many hard choices ahead of us." Okay, so in this year 1 timeline, we see two of our characters, Professor X and Magneto, approaching the castle of Mr. Sinister, a classic X-Men villain. They're halted at the entrance and they explain that they're there to see Mr. Sinister. They call him by his real name, Nathaniel Essex. The guard reveals himself as a clone of Mr. Sinister and begins to pretty much waste time by making comments like Magneto's cape looks ridiculous and Professor X looks like a sad man in his wheelchair. Magneto has no time for this, so he hurls him against the wall like the gangster that he is on some, "You're going to escort us or watch what happens to you." 2 minutes later, we cut to the clone bowing and introducing them to Sinister. So much for that, right? So they're going through the typical formalities and Sinister stops them to let them know how much he loves Magneto's cape. "Why don't I have a cape?" he asks. He even has one of his subjects executed on the spot for not having suggested how good he would look in one. Then he continues his conversation with Professor X like nothing happened. They tell him they're there to discuss his work with genetics. They explain that they need him to create a database of all mutant DNA and make it safe and secure. They begin to explain why they need him to work on the mutant gene, and Sinister begins to protest. All of a sudden, he's shot point blank by another Sinister clone. This one now tells them, "Hey, I'd be more than happy to work with you on this because I'm a version that has the mutant gene in him." Professor X then tells him to get started and then prevents Sinister through a slight mind wipe from remembering why he's doing it to begin with until the day the professor reminds him. Now we cut to a future timeline. It's Professor X arriving in the sentient mutant island of Krakoa. He's explaining to his companion Douglas, a mutant who can understand and decipher a multitude of languages, that it's not to be seen as a foe anymore. He's referring to the island. He's made contact with the island and he's establishing a good relationship with it so far. Professor tells Douglas he wants to introduce him to the island and they begin to communicate as Douglas begins to crack the code of understanding and translating what the island is saying. He actually begins to get the hang of it, slightly. He then tells Professor X that the ancient island said it used to be known as Okara, which means the one land. Evil forces from within the island caused it to split into two, known as Orako and Krakoa. From that split, the evil forces began to emerge. He goes on to further explain that an ancient blue god, and we see that as Apocalypse on the page, forced the Orako half down below, and he created his 4 horsemen to oversee it. He basically closed the rift shut forever, and Krakoa remained as just half of what it used to be, never being fully complete again. We then see Professor X explain to Douglas that he needs him to stay on the island to spearhead some important work. and telepathically shows him his plans. He basically wants Douglas to stay and work on developing the Krakoan language, which according to Douglas could take a few months to a year. He throws him his duffel bag of belongings and tells him to get to it. In this scene, we're in another future timeline 1,000 years ahead. We come upon a group from a previous issue that has summoned an empire called the Phalanx to try to become a part of them. What the Phalanx do is take on the collected intelligence of a civilization and determine whether or not they are acceptable to join them, to ascend, as they call it. It's a bit confusing to understand, but from what I can gather, this group with the blue faces, accompanied by the future Nimrod drone, are trying to find a way to become accepted by transplanting their elder's conscience into a machine, because biological bodies are no good for this process. So they didn't submit the original, but a copy. Kind of like giving someone a photocopy of $1 instead of the real dollar and seeing if they accept it. Not the best cliffhanger to end the issue with, but at least with what Professor X is working on with Sinister and Douglas, made the issue worthwhile. We'll have to wait and see what this scene pans out to be in future issues. We end with another quote from the professor. "I'm not afraid of what I've done, but I do fear what it will cost one day." What is he telling us with that quote? Has he put himself in danger with what he did in this issue? What does he fear is the cost? Was it making a deal with Sinister, or establishing a relationship with an island that used to be a mutant graveyard? What's all this DNA being gathered and indexed for? Let's see what happens next week. So for this week's issue, my musical recommendation is Sean Lennon, and the track is called Dead Meat. I just feel the message of the song is loud and clear, just like what our characters are going through. They're building up their strategy to prevent their extinction. He's the son of a legend, and if you're not familiar with him, at least you can add something new to your musical library. And as always, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at thelastcomicbookstanding, and on Twitter at TLCBS Podcast. I'll see you again next week for House of X number 5. Take care.